Welcome to a true life story. It all began on a humid summer morning in Virginia. The air was thick with heat, my scarf clinging to my neck as I stood outside a modest brick house. This was my first job in America, thousands of miles away from the dusty streets of Bala where I grew up. Back home, I never imagined leaving my family, my small world. But life has a way of throwing curveballs. The Jacobs family, a picture-perfect foursome, needed a nanny. And me, I needed a job. It wasn't just about the money, though that mattered too. This was about proving something to myself and my family. I wanted to show them I could make it, that I could thrive in a place so far from everything I knew. At 33, I was unmarried, fiercely independent, a rarity for a Jordanian woman. Brianna Jacobs, the wife, was the epitome of polished elegance. She breezed into the room in tailored blouses and designer heels that clicked against the marble floors of their sprawling home. Her blonde hair was perfectly swept into a bun, and she had this deliberate way of speaking, as if every word was chosen with care. Then there was Zach, her husband. Tall, relaxed, and effortlessly charming. Zach had sandy brown hair with curls at the ends and laugh lines that spoke of a life filled with joy, not just stress. He didn't say much that first day, just nodded politely and handed me a cup of tea. Their kids, Splendor and Emmanuel, were 5 and 3, bundles of energy and endless questions. I was nervous, of course. I never worked as a nanny before, but Brianna assured me that being the eldest of 6 siblings was qualification enough. She was kind, but you could tell she was a perfectionist. She handed me this thick asterisk binder filled with rules, meal plans, daily schedules, emergency numbers, even instructions on folding laundry. The first few weeks were uneventful. My morning started at 6 a.m. I'd whip up breakfast, pack Splendor's lunch, and keep Emmanuel entertained until his nap time. My days were a whirlwind of storybooks, finger painting, and chasing Emmanuel around the backyard. By night, I'd retreat to my tiny room in the basement, exhausted but content. But then, everything changed. It was a quiet afternoon about a month into the job. Emmanuel had spilled his juice box, and I was kneeling on the kitchen floor, wiping it up when I felt someone watching me. "You're amazing with them," Zach said, leaning casually against the counter. Startled, I looked up. "Oh, thank you, sir." "Please," he said with a smile that reached his eyes. "Call me Zach." I nodded, feeling my cheeks flush. "It wasn't just asterisk what asterisk he said. It was asterisk how asterisk he said it, like he genuinely meant it." Back home, men rarely spoke to women with such warmth unless they had an agenda. But Zach? He seemed different. After that day, I started noticing him more. The way he'd ask if I'd eaten lunch, how he'd offer to help carry groceries, how he lingered in the kitchen when I cooked. Brianna, on the other hand, was often absent, caught up in the demands of her high-powered corporate career. One evening, as I was setting the dining table, Zach asked, "Don't you ever get tired?" And that's when everything began to shift. "What's it like to do everything for everyone?" Zach's question lingered in the air. I shrugged, giving him a small smile. "It's my job. I'm used to it." "You shouldn't have to be," he said softly. His words hung in my mind long after he left the room. It felt strange being seen like that. In my culture, women are expected to give endlessly, to serve without question. But Zach's words made me feel something I wasn't used to, appreciation. I tried to brush it off, reminding myself of who I was and what I stood for. I was a Muslim woman, bound by faith and tradition. There were lines I wouldn't cross, no matter how kind or charming my employer might be. But life has a way of ignoring the rules we set for ourselves. That summer stretched on, with days that felt both endless and sweltering. Brianna's work trips grew more frequent, leaving Zach and me to handle the kids. Slowly, the boundaries began to blur. At first, it was harmless, shared jokes, lingering glances, conversations that felt a little too comfortable. But deep down, I knew I was treading on dangerous ground. I often heard my mother's voice in my mind, her tone stern and unyielding. "Asterisk Elia, Remember who you are. This world will tempt you, but you must stay true to yourself. Asterisk. I had always prided myself on my self-control, my ability to resist the temptations of the modern world. But Zach was different. Then came the night everything shifted. The rain tapped softly against the windows, and the house was quiet, the kids already asleep. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner, when Zach walked in. Need some help? He asked, rolling up his sleeves. I shook my head. No, it's okay, I'm almost done. But he stayed anyway. For a while, we worked in silence, the air between us heavy with words we weren't saying. Then, finally, he spoke. Do you ever miss home? Every day, I admitted, but I came here for a reason. You've sacrificed so much, he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. I looked up at him, surprised. Why do you say that? Because I see it, he replied. The way you put everyone else first, the way you never complain. It's rare. His words caught me off guard. No one had ever spoken to me like that before, not even back home. A strange mix of gratitude and guilt washed over me, as though I was betraying something sacred just by standing there, listening. It's nothing special, I said, rushing off the compliment. It is to me, he replied, his eyes locking with mine. And in that moment, something shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A connection, a spark, a silent acknowledgement of something neither of us dared to name. That night, I went to bed with a heavy heart, torn between my faith and these growing feelings I couldn't seem to ignore. I prayed for strength, for clarity, for the courage to stay on the right path. But deep down, I knew my world was about to change in ways I could never have imagined. I thought I could keep things professional, that whatever fleeting connection I felt with Zach would disappear like a passing cloud. But life is never that simple. Each day brought new moments, small, seemingly insignificant on the surface, yet each one chipped away at the walls I'd built around my heart. Brianna's absences became routine. She was off to conferences in New York, business meetings in Chicago, or staying overnight at luxury hotels I'd only seen in magazines. And Zach, he became the constant parent, and I became his partner. In the chaos of daily life with Splendor and Emmanuel, it was clear the kids adored Zach. Splendor would climb onto his lap during story time, her little hands clutching his shirt as he read in the most animated, funny voices. Emmanuel followed him everywhere, mimicking his every move. Watching them together, I saw a side of Zach that was raw, tender, and completely unguarded, and it stirred something in me I couldn't quite name. One afternoon, as I sat folding laundry in the living room, Zach walked in carrying a box. I thought you might like this, he said, setting it down on the coffee table. Curious, I wiped my hands on my apron. What is it? He opened the box to reveal a set of cookbooks. I noticed you've been experimenting with recipes lately. Thought this might inspire you. I stared at him, speechless. It wasn't just the gift. It was the thought behind it. No one had ever noticed the little things I did, let alone appreciated them. Thank you, I said softly, my voice catching. It's nothing, he replied, but the look in his eyes told a different story. Later that evening, after the kids were asleep, Zach and I found ourselves in the kitchen again. These quiet moments had become something of a ritual, a reprieve after the day's chaos. I was wiping down the counters when he spoke. You work too hard, Alia. Startled, I glanced up. It's my job. He shook his head. No, you do more than your job. You care. You love these kids like they're your own. They're easy to love, I said, trying to deflect. So are you, he replied. His words hung in the air between us, heavy and dangerous. I froze, unsure how to respond. Alia, he began, but I cut him off. It's okay, I said quickly, even though it wasn't. We stood there in silence, his words pressing down on me like a weight. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that I wasn't easy to love, that I was complicated, flawed, and bound by rules he could never understand. But instead, I said nothing. The days blurred together after that. I told myself nothing had changed, but deep down, I knew it had. Zach's presence was everywhere, His laughter echoed through the house, his scent lingered in the air, and his words replayed in my mind long after he was gone. I began noticing the little things about him. The way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the way he hummed softly while doing dishes, the way he made sure the kids always said please and thank you. He wasn't just kind, he was thoughtful in a way that felt rare and precious. One afternoon, as I'd pushed Splendor on the swing, Zach came outside with a tray of iced tea. "Thought you might need a break," he said, handing me a glass. "Thank you," I said, taking it gratefully. We sat on the porch steps, watching the kids play. "Do you ever think about what your life could have been?" he asked suddenly. I looked at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I mean if you'd stayed in Bala, if you hadn't come here." "All the time," I admitted, "but I came here for a reason." "And have you found it?" he asked, his gaze steady. I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "In some ways, yes, but in others, it's complicated." He nodded as if he understood. "Life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it?" "It does," I whispered. We sat there in silence, the air between us thick with unspoken words. I wanted to tell him how much his kindness meant to me, how his presence had become a comfort in a world that often felt lonely and foreign. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking of my family back home. My mother's prayers, my father's stern warnings. Stay true to your faith, they'd always said. Never forget who you are. I wanted to believe I was still that girl who prayed 5 times a day and wore her scarf with pride. But the truth was, I was changing, and it terrified me. The next morning, I avoided Zach as much as I could. I threw myself into chores, keeping my head down and my mind occupied. But by the afternoon, it was impossible to avoid him. He found me in the laundry room, sorting through a pile of clothes. "Aliyah," he said softly. I didn't look up. "Yes? Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I replied quickly. But he didn't believe me. "Please don't shut me out," he said, stepping closer. "I know I crossed the line." "It's not about you," I interrupted, finally meeting his gaze. "It's about me, my beliefs, my faith." "I understand," he said, but the look in his eyes told me he didn't. "How could he?" "I can't," I began, but the words caught in my throat. "I can't do this." He nodded slowly, regret etched on his face. "I'm sorry, Aliyah. I never wanted to make you uncomfortable." "You didn't," I said quickly. "That's the problem." For a moment, we just stood there, the silence between us saying everything we couldn't. "I'll give you space," he said finally. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice trembling. As he left the room, I felt a wave of relief mixed with an ache I couldn't name. I knew I was doing the right thing, but it didn't make it any easier. That night, I prayed harder than ever, prayed for strength, for guidance, for the courage to stay true to myself. As tears streamed down my face, I realized something. I wasn't just fighting temptation. I was fighting a part of myself I didn't recognize. In the days that followed, Zach kept his promise to give me space. I threw myself into my job, crafts with the kids, baking projects, anything to keep us all busy. But even as my hands stayed occupied, my mind wandered back to him. This was the best way forward, or so I kept telling myself. For a while, I convinced myself we could pretend nothing had happened, that the conversation in the laundry room was just a fleeting moment of weakness, and for a time, it almost worked. Then came the storm. It was a Friday evening, just after sunset, when the rain started. The thunder came first, shaking the windows and sending Emmanuel running to cling to my leg as I cleaned the dinner table. "Don't worry, Emmanuel," I said, scooping him up. "It's just a little noise. Let's get you ready for bed, okay?" "Okay," he said, his tiny arms wrapping around my neck. Upstairs, I read his favorite bedtime story while the rain drummed steadily against the windows. By the time both kids were sound asleep, the storm had intensified. The wind howled, and the house felt unnervingly quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. I headed downstairs, expecting to find Zach in his usual spot on the couch, but instead, I found him in the kitchen, staring out the window with a glass of wine in his hand. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, and the soft glow of the kitchen light outlined the sharp angles of his jaw. He looked deep in thought, and for a moment, I hesitated in the doorway, unsure whether to interrupt. "You don't drink wine, do you?" he asked suddenly, without turning around, as if he could sense I was there. "No," I replied, stepping into the room. "It's against my faith." He nodded, finally turning to face me. "I figured as much. You're different. Is that a bad thing?" I asked, a small smile tugging at my lips. "Not at all," he said softly. "It's refreshing." I busied myself wiping down the counters, trying to ignore the way his words made my pulse quicken. The tension in the room was undeniable, and I could feel his gaze on me as I worked. "Aliyah," he said after a long pause. "Yes," I replied, still avoiding his eyes. "Can we talk?" I stopped wiping and turned to face him. "About what?" "About us," he said. Over the next few weeks, we stole moments wherever we could, a lingering touch in the hallway, whispered conversations in the kitchen after the kids were asleep, a hurried embrace behind a closed door. Each time, I swore it would be the last, but it never was. Zach became my addiction, and I was powerless to resist him. He made me forget everything, my faith, my upbringing, the values I once held so dearly. For a while, I let myself believe we could keep this up, that we could exist in our own little bubble, untouched by the world outside. But deep down, I knew it couldn't last. Bubbles always burst, leaving devastation in their wake. Life became a blur of stolen moments and whispered promises that filled me with both ecstasy and dread. Zach and I were careful, but reckless. We found time for each other when Brianna wasn't home, when the kids were asleep, or when the house was empty. During the day, I was Aliyah, the devoted nanny who read bedtime stories, cooked meals, and laughed with Splendor and Emmanuel. But at night, in the stillness of the house, I became someone else entirely, someone who belonged to Zach in ways I'd never belonged to anyone. One quiet evening, after the kids were tucked into bed, Zach found me in the living room folding laundry. Brianna had left that morning for another work trip, and the house felt eerily still. "Do you ever stop working?" he asked, leaning casually in the doorway, amusement lacing his tone. I glanced up, unable to suppress a small smile. "Someone has to keep this place running." He crossed the room and sat beside me, his thigh brushing against mine. "You're amazing, you know that?" I shook my head, laughing softly. "I'm just doing my job." "No," he said, his tone serious now. "You're more than that. You've done more for this family than Brianna or I ever could." The mention of her name hit me like a sharp pang of guilt. I looked away, focusing on the pile of clothes in front of me. "You shouldn't say that." "Why not? It's true. You love her, Zach. She's your wife." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I do love her. But not the way I should. Not the way I love you." His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that this was nothing more than a mistake. But I couldn't, because deep down, I knew I felt the same. He reached for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine. "Aliyah, look at me." Reluctantly, I lifted my eyes to meet his. The intensity in his gaze made my breath catch. "You mean everything to me," he said, his voice low. "I know this isn't right, but I can't imagine my life without you." The tears I'd been holding back finally spilled over, and he pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly as I cried. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I never meant for this to happen." "Neither did I," he said softly, "but I don't regret it." As weeks turned into months, our affair became harder to hide. Brianna's frequent absences gave us the freedom to indulge in our forbidden relationship, but her presence at home was unbearable. I avoided her as much as I could, ashamed to look her in the eye. She was kind to me, trusting, even, and utterly unaware of the betrayal unfolding beneath her roof. "Aliyah, you've been such a blessing to this family," she said one evening as we sat in the kitchen. "I don't know how we ever managed before you came along." Her words felt like a knife to my chest. Forcing a smile, I replied, "Thank you, Mrs. Jacobs." "Please," she said, laughing lightly, "call me Brianna. You're practically part of the family." Her trust only deepened my guilt. But it didn't stop me. Each night, after Brianna went to bed, Zach would find me. Sometimes we'd talk for hours, diving into conversations that felt like uncharted territory. Other times, words weren't necessary. We just hold each other, letting the silence of the house wrap around us. More often than not, those quiet moments ended in his bed, where passion erased everything else, every worry, every thought. Then there was that one night, the one that changed everything. Brianna had left for a weekend conference, leaving the house eerily quiet. Zach and I found ourselves in the living room, sharing a bottle of wine. I hadn't planned on drinking, but he insisted, pouring me a glass with a teasing grin that I couldn't resist. I took a sip, then another, and the warmth of the wine started to melt away my carefully constructed walls. "You're beautiful," he said, his voice low and rough, like he'd been holding the words in for too long. I laughed it off, shaking my head. "You're just saying that." "I'm not," he said, leaning in closer, his gaze locking onto mine. "You're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen." Before I could respond, his lips found mine. It wasn't tentative or questioning. It was sure, overwhelming, and impossible to resist. This wasn't just about desire. It was deeper, messier, and more consuming than I'd ever imagined. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer, and in that moment, I let go, completely. We didn't even make it to the bedroom that night. Instead, we stayed there on the living room floor, the flickering light of the fireplace casting dancing shadows on the walls as we lost ourselves in each other. It was raw, uninhibited, and nothing short of electric. The next morning, I woke up in his arms, the events of the night before playing in a loop in my mind. I thought I should feel guilty, ashamed even, but instead I felt content. For the first time in forever, I felt like I belonged. I slipped out of his arms to get dressed and started making breakfast for the kids. Zach walked into the kitchen not long after, his expression softer than I'd ever seen it. "Good morning," he said, pressing a kiss to my forehead. "Morning," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. His tone shifted, serious now. "We need to talk." I nodded. He was right, of course. We couldn't keep pretending this wasn't happening. We couldn't keep living in this fantasy we created. But even as I agreed, a part of me wasn't ready to let go. The days that followed blurred together. Zach and I grew reckless, consumed by the fire we'd ignited. Every moment alone felt like a stolen treasure, a secret I clung to even as it weighed me down. The guilt started creeping in though. With every shared glance, every touch, it grew heavier. Brianna came back from her conference the following Monday. The sound of her footsteps, the familiarity of her presence, it was a jarring reminder of the life we were quietly unraveling. A life I wasn't sure we could ever put back together. Piece by piece, she remained as warm and cheerful as ever, completely unaware of the betrayal happening right under her nose. Watching Brianna laugh and play with the kids, I felt a deep ache of shame. She didn't deserve this. None of them did. One evening, after Brianna had gone to bed, I found myself sitting on the porch steps. The night was still, the stars scattered across the dark sky like shards of glass. I wrapped my scarf tightly around my shoulders, trying to block out the cold, and the storm of thoughts swirling in my mind. I heard the soft creak of footsteps behind me. Zach joined me, settling down beside me, close enough that our shoulders brushed. "You've been quiet," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. "I've been thinking," I replied, still staring out at the sky. "About us." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's complicated." "It's more than complicated," I said, my voice trembling. "It's wrong. Zach, you have a wife, a family. And I've lost myself in this. I don't even recognize who I am anymore." His hand found mine, his touch gentle but firm. "You're still you, Alia. You're the woman who loves my kids like they're your own. The woman who brought life back into this house. Don't let this ruin everything." I pulled my hand away, tears staining my eyes. "But it has, Zach. Don't you see? We've ruined everything." For the first time, his composure cracked. "I love you, Alia," he said, his voice breaking. "I can't lose you." His words hit me like a wave, crashing into everything I'd been trying to suppress. I loved him too, There was no denying it anymore. But love wasn't enough to undo the damage we'd done. "I love you too," I whispered, the admission tumbling out before I could stop it. "But this is destroying me." The following week, I made the hardest decision of my life. I couldn't stay, not like this. The weight of what we'd done was too much to bear, and I knew I had to leave. Quietly, I started looking for a new job, reaching out to agencies and families in need of a nanny. It wasn't easy. I loved Splendor and Emmanuel more than I could put into words, and the thought of leaving them broke my heart. But staying meant losing myself completely. One night, as I tucked Splendor into bed, she looked up at me with her wide, innocent eyes and asked, "Aliyah, are you leaving?" Her question caught me off guard. "Why would you think that, sweetheart?" "Because you've been sad," she said simply. "And Daddy says people leave when they're sad." I forced a smile, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I'm not going anywhere right now, Splendor. Go to sleep, okay?" She nodded and closed her eyes, but her words stayed with me. People leave when they're sad. She was right. I was leaving because I couldn't stay in a place that had become a prison of my own making. 2 weeks later, I handed in my resignation. Brianna was stunned, her face a mix of confusion and concern. "Aliyah, is everything okay?" she asked, setting down her coffee cup. "Yes, Mrs. Jacob," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I've been offered another position, and I think it's time for me to move on." Her expression softened, but I could see the hurt in her eyes. "You've been such an important part of this family. Are you sure?" I nodded, avoiding her gaze. "I'm sure." When I told Zach, he didn't argue. He just nodded, his jaw tight, his eyes clouded with something I couldn't quite read. Anger, sadness, regret, maybe all of it. "I can't change your mind, can I?" he asked quietly. "No," I said firmly. "I have to do this." The day I left was bittersweet. Splendor and Emmanuel clung to me, their tearful goodbyes breaking my heart into a million pieces. Brianna hugged me tightly, thanking me for everything I'd done for their family. And Zach, he stood silently by the door, his fists clenched at his sides as I loaded my suitcase into the taxi. As the car pulled away, the house that had been both my refuge and my prison faded into the distance. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. I had to find myself again. I had to reconnect with the faith and values I'd lost. And most importantly, I had to forgive myself. That night, in a small apartment across town, I knelt on the floor and prayed for the first time in months. A strange peace washed over me. I wasn't perfect, and I'd made mistakes, but I was ready to start over. Hey everyone, if this story pulled at your heartstrings or left you wanting more, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more gripping, emotional stories. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update. And if you've got your own wild stories or ideas you'd love to see brought to life, drop them in the comments below. I'd love to hear them. Thanks for watching.